So I want to come back into this integrating together some of these pieces, especially affect and pattern and the way that memory supports them, into something I'm calling optimal zone. Now, I'm hardly the first. This sort of curve of neurological arousal versus performance first hit the scientific literature in 1908. And it's used a lot in sports medicine, with the idea that the best sports performance happens when you're juiced but not too juiced. If you get too juiced, it doesn't work. I got interested in this relative to some of the fabulous work that's been done in the last couple of decades around trauma healing. It's something that applies actually quite broadly, but the fabulous part of being able to tie it into what's happening in your body is that we can go beyond just some of the familiar philosophical discussions to something that becomes a little more grounded. The core way that I would describe what it's like to be in your optimal zone is that you feel engaged and present. You're in the here and now, you're engaged with whatever you're doing, you're really there. But there's some other characteristics that I find people talk about, and I would relate to as well. Playfulness, productive, integrated, forgiving, self-aware, enthused, appreciative, peaceful, honest. Those are all characteristics that just seem to be there naturally for people when they are in their optimal zones. Their optimal zones relative to their neurological arousal. I like to say it's the place you can have fun and get tasks done. And in fact, one of the things that's really important about it is that it is a place where the struggle between various polarities changes actually into a partnership. And the tension between people who want to get the task done and people who say, oh, we need to spend more time on our relationships, doesn't seem to be so much of an issue when you really have everybody there in that optimal zone, because you get both. Fabulous. However, clearly we humans don't spend as much time there as would be wonderful. So what is it that moves us out of our optimal zone? Some things are just in the present, like you get tired. Or at the other end, you can get overstimulated. There are all sorts of different ways in which you can get stretched beyond that optimal. So let's look at this from a biological point of view so that we can put this in place. There's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system that act in a dance with each other. And that's what the neurological arousal is actually measuring, is how strong is the sympathetic versus how strong is the parasympathetic. But modern understanding, I would say, is that it's not just the two, but it's actually three, because the upper torso part of the parasympathetic is all about connection. And in fact, when something comes along that disturbs us, our first inclination that we learn as infants is to check in with our peeps, to see what the other people around us, the important people around us, think or feel, or often it's just with a glance. And if you're by yourself, it can be with your internalized important people. Nevertheless, the first thing you do is check in. If the message you get back at that level is it's okay, and you feel like you've had some connection, then you may just be able to deal with it fine. But if your important people don't respond to you, or the message that you get back is one of fear on their part, or freak out, or whatever it is, then you move on to the mobilize. And this is where we get the fight or flight. Fight or flight is kind of the extreme portion of mobilize. Mobilize can be really important. I wouldn't be able to give this talk if I didn't have a certain amount of sympathetic nervous system mobilization going on. And then you get the lower part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is oriented towards rest and rebuild, which is great. But if it goes to its extreme, it goes to freeze. I've laid out those three, but I want to particularly talk a little bit about connection and affinity because it's so important for us as humans. It's hardwired in, as we were just seeing. And it's hardwired in for infants. The reality of an infant is that they are so dependent in the first years that the most important thing is that they are connected with someone who can address their dependency. And therefore, it winds up being a deep, deep framework for safety. It also is a really important decision-making guide for us. That is, we often turn to other people. Anything that you don't necessarily want to figure out in all of its detail on your own, if you want to make a decision, you probably check in with somebody that you respect. And it is the most prominent thing that people are willing to die for. One of the bits of military wisdom, if you will, is that soldiers don't fight and die for a cause, they don't fight and die for a country, they fight and die for their buddies when it's in the heat of battle. And you have all kinds of places where people, because of their sense of connection to their child, to their parent, to their loved one in whatever form, that's what can move them to the point of taking risks so strong that they may risk their lives. Okay, so I want to step back to looking at I've laid out here the freeze, rest, rebuild, connect, mobilize, and fight, flight, the way they lay out on this. And this is not an exhaustive catalog, but just to give you a sense that as you move along here, first you anxious, fearful, triggered, panicked, as you get further out in the red side. And here, spacey, withdrawn, dissociated, frozen, here on the blue side. Psychologists talk about both the downside and the upside as dysregulated. That means that you're not able to regulate what's happening in the balance between your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And in the middle, it's regulated. Regulation, being able to achieve regulation, is a really important thing. And we learn about it first as infants. Infant expresses a need. If the caregiver gives a response, then the infant is able to regulate through the help of the caregiver. But it doesn't always work out that way. So that was an example where you have the caregiver is responsive, the infant has the needs met, the child develops self-regulation and empathy, importantly. And it's described as a secure attachment. So let's move down the list. If the caregiver is erratic, sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't respond. It's just, this develops an infant that has tantrums and I mean, they all do to some extent, but it gets really into it, just tries harder and harder. Develops urgency and distrust. So that's about 20% of the adult population. If the caregiver is simply non-responsive, just isn't doing the caregiving, then the child, to the extent that they're able to still survive, withdraws and hardens. This is called anxious avoidant, and it's 15%. And then you have caregivers who are either themselves fearful or abusive, so that the child has this deep instinctual sense that they should be going towards that caregiver, but it's painful when they do. And this puts them in a very confusing bind, about 5% of the population. These are examples of a kind of trauma. And what you have in trauma is a certain kind of neurological overload, sometimes described as too much, too fast, or inescapable. If it's unresolved, that is, if the neurological shock winds up not having a chance to somehow or another get resolved, then it winds up often leading to habitual defenses. And I have yet to meet a person for whom there isn't some of this going on. We all have some degree of trauma in our lives. And a lot of the really persistent defense patterns, ironically, just regroove the trauma and actually make it harder to resolve. That's why they're persistent. And they keep confirming the beliefs that went into the trauma. And especially once you've started to get a groove established, then even minor stresses can wind up continuing to contribute. And those defenses trigger these out of proportion reactions, like these. And I'll just talk about a few here. Transference is when you have had some experience in your past with, say, a person, maybe one of your parents, and then you're interacting with somebody else, and all of a sudden you are treating that other person as if that person was your parent, with all the expectations you have, all the grievances you have, everything. You just transfer from that old experience into the present in a way in which you lose touch with the reality that's here now. Compensation is when you feel something inside and do an exaggerated form of the opposite on the surface. So if somebody feels weak and vulnerable, they may be aggressive in order to provide compensation for it. Anyway, I won't go through the whole list. Probably you've all seen various forms of all this. So what do these defensive behaviors do? They wind up depressing your potential, so the curve goes down. And I want to make the distinction that moving back and forth this way can be on a fairly short time scale. In fact, geez, if you get somebody who's triggered, they may be grooving along here and then boom, they're over here. Very quick. And certainly in children, you see the movement back and forth across this spectrum all the time, very quickly. The depression of this curve is a longer term issue. And the higher the trauma load, the more that potential gets depressed. So that's a problem statement, and in every problem statement there is an opportunity. So the opportunity that I see, I want to use a metaphor that about 100 years ago people figured out about germs and figured out that if you washed your hands, and I guess a little earlier they figured out if you didn't drink your shit water, then your kids wouldn't all die. And some of the adults wouldn't die either. There was a time when only about 20% of children in England reached the age of 5. And almost all of that was through infectious diseases that were spread because people didn't understand about washing their hands. Discovering that we could make a big difference by washing our hands was a very inexpensive intervention that was the major shift in the way population growth has happened on the planet in the last 100 years. Suppose that we could come up with the equivalent of optimal zone hygiene. Instead of washing our hands, figure out what it is, what are some of the simple ways that we could, in fact, help ourselves to clear out all the clutter that accumulates day to day, and help each other. So here are just a few of the ways that can be done. Name it to tame it. Sometimes just being able to talk about it enough to be able to surface it helps to get it out of your system. Shake it off. The shaking is actually a pretty significant way of doing just hygiene. If you've had something that has left you a little shaky, so to speak, we're acculturated to not shake. And yet if we do, it frees up all of those, all those neurons in the back in the cerebellum, and You'll notice that animals do that a lot. When an animal has had something that's been upsetting in some form or another, they will often shake it off. I'd love to have a culture in which that was the norm for us. Breathe deep. Breathing is really powerful relative to the impact on especially that upper part of the parasympathetic nervous system. Wriggle your nose, lift your cheeks. We've been through that. Choose kindness. That's also a wonderful way. Hug, appropriate touch, and then of course eat and rest and all of these things. And anything that can release held stress. So not only is there optimal zone hygiene, there's also optimal zone first aid, with the idea being that it's not just a matter of what you do for yourself around the daily hygiene stuff, but how can you help others? And I'd especially love to have the sense of optimal zone as something consciously understood in groups. So in a business meeting, one of the things that's up on the wall is this chart of the optimal zone. And everybody in the group has an understanding of what that is and has agreed beforehand to what are some of the first aid principles that we should bring into effect when somebody goes off into one of the wings. Right now, as a culture, we're really poor in how we deal with it when somebody goes off in one of those wings. We could become a lot better. Like any first aid, you need to train before you need it. Center yourself, slow down, breathe. Put your own mask on first, basically. Because it's so easy when someone is triggered for it to then ricochet back and forth in the group, and everybody gets triggered. It's also important to acknowledge the signal in that trigger for that. But you can't really deal with the signal until people have gotten back into their optimal zones. Connect through empathy and kindness. And one of the ways to return the focus to the present, because almost always when you're off in one of those wings, you're so activated by something in the past that you're not connected to the present. So if you can connect into your body, into breathing, into all that kinesthetic, somatic stuff, you're in a much better place. And then if we've got hygiene and first aid, we need healing as well. And I want to emphasize that my sense is that you've got to do it both in the body and with the belief systems. If you only change some of your beliefs, there's enough stuff stuck in your body that it will trip you up again. And if you only clear out some of that stuff in the body but hold on to those beliefs, you'll again be in trouble. And this goes back to the way in which you can change your affective relationship. You can change your emotional relationship with the past, which will change your relationship with the present, which will change your relationship with the future. I remember someone saying that forgiveness is not about the past, it's about the future. You forgive for the sake of your own future. But let's put this in a slightly larger context. Back to the shift from empire to planetary. Because we have trauma around, not just as some floating thing that just happened. I used these images in the previous presentation. This is the standard of Ur, which was a city in Sumer back 4,500 years ago. And this side there are two sides to this, but I'll go back to this side. This side shows a battle. And key in this are the prisoners, naked, wounded, totally humiliated, being brought to the king. As with any battle, there's an enormous amount of trauma that's going on, and trauma that is spread out beyond those who are actually in the battle. And then the other side of this standard of Ur shows three gradations of hierarchy The sort of the working serfs down here, kind of middlemen here, and the nobles up here. And the hierarchical system of the Empire era was based on this interesting discovery that you could traumatize, if you brutalized a few people, you could traumatize a whole lot more people. And the trauma would stick. And in fact, parents would pass the trauma on to their children. It's still part of our heritage. And you see right now in what's going on in the Middle East, that being sort of played out anew with beheadings and all the rest of it. But that was standard operating procedure for thousands of years. So what can we do? To the extent that we are able to get much, much better at how we consciously, intentionally, as a group, as a culture, are able to deal with our optimal zone and our times when we move out of it, and be able to bring ourselves back into it, be able to bring each other back into it, have it as something in the culture within groups, then it winds up meaning that we don't get stuck with it. I'm not going to say that it's the solution, but it's a powerful intervention in terms of how we get to a world fundamentally at peace. We need to be able to really go into the depths of what it takes to not only personally get to our optimal zones, but do that as a group, as a culture.